The year was 1864, and in the sacred heart of Canyon de Chelly, Arizona, a place the Navajo called home for generations, American soldiers under Colonel Kit Carson were systematically destroying 3,000 peach trees that had fed families for centuries. As axes bit into ancient wood and flames consumed orchards older than the United States itself, Navajo families watched from the canyon walls, starving and freezing, knowing that surrender meant death by slow degrees, and resistance meant death by bullet or starvation. What these families didn't know as they watched their world burn was that this was just the beginning of what would become America's darkest hour. A forced march of over 400 miles through winter snow, where thousands would die, followed by 4 years of imprisonment in a concentration camp disguised as a reservation, all orchestrated by a government that called it civilization and executed by a frontier hero whose name would become synonymous with betrayal. This is the story of Kit Carson and the Navajo Long Walk, where manifest destiny revealed its true face, where a famous explorer became the architect of ethnic cleansing, and where an entire people nearly vanished from history because they refused to stop being who they were. Before we descend into this nightmare that American textbooks prefer to ignore, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We're genuinely curious to know where our audience is located around the world, and your engagement means everything as we work to bring these hidden histories to light. To understand how a beloved American folk hero could become the executioner of an entire people, you need to understand the Navajo before the catastrophe, before the soldiers came, before their world was reduced to ashes and forced marches. The Navajo, who called themselves Diné, simply the people, had inhabited the Southwest for centuries, their territory spanning what is now northeastern Arizona, northwestern New Mexico, southeastern Utah, and southwestern Colorado. They called this sacred land Dinéta, bounded by 4 holy mountains that defined not just geography but cosmology, not just territory but identity itself. The Diné weren't a single unified nation in the European sense. They organized themselves into matrilineal clans, extended family networks that owned land collectively and made decisions through consensus rather than centralized authority. Their economy was remarkably sophisticated, built on agriculture inherited from ancient Puebloan peoples, corn, beans, squash grown in careful rotation, combined with sheep herding adopted from Spanish colonizers who had invaded centuries earlier. Those sheep became everything to Navajo life. They provided food, wool for the legendary Navajo blankets that traders prized across the continent, and served as the primary measure of wealth and status. A man with large flocks was respected. A family without sheep faced poverty and social marginalization. But the Diné were also warriors, and this is crucial to understanding what came next. They conducted raids against neighboring tribes, against Mexican settlements, against anyone they considered enemies or simply sources of livestock and captives. This wasn't mindless violence, it was economic warfare, a way of redistributing resources in a harsh environment where survival often meant taking from those weaker than yourself. The Navajo took captives who could be adopted into clans, used as labor, or sold to Mexican and later American traders, who maintained a robust slave market, despite laws technically prohibiting it. And the Navajo themselves were targets. Apache raiders, Mexican militias, and later American forces captured Navajo women and children, selling them in markets across New Mexico, and even as far as California. This cycle of raid and counter-raid, of violence and retaliation, had defined Southwestern life for generations, creating hatreds that festered across decades and provided the United States government with the perfect excuse for what they were planning to do. When the United States conquered New Mexico and Arizona from Mexico in 1846 during the Mexican-American War, they inherited what American officials called the Navajo problem. For the Diné, the problem was different. They had just traded one colonial master for another, and the Americans seemed even more determined to control every aspect of indigenous life than the Spanish or Mexicans had ever been. Between 1846 and the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, the pattern repeated endlessly. Treaties would be signed promising peace and mutual respect. Navajo leaders would agree to stop raiding American settlements, and then either settlers would violate Navajo territory, or young Navajo warriors would ignore their elders and conduct raids anyway, and the cycle of violence would resume. The American military response was always disproportionate. For every stolen cow, they demanded total submission. For every raid, they threatened extermination. The situation was a powder keg waiting for someone ruthless enough to apply the spark, and in 1862, that man arrived in New Mexico with the rank of general and absolute conviction that he knew how to solve the Indian problem once and for all. General James Henry Carleton was a career military officer who believed in manifest destiny with religious fervor. He looked at the Navajo and saw obstacles to American civilization, savages who needed to be either transformed into compliant Christian farmers or eliminated entirely. Carleton didn't hide his intentions. He wrote explicitly that the only solution was total subjugation or destruction, and he meant every word. His plan was brutally simple: force the Navajo off their ancestral lands and relocate them to a reservation called Bosque Redondo on the Pecos River in eastern New Mexico, over 300 miles from Dineta. There, far from their sacred mountains and traditional territories surrounded by military force, the Navajo would be broken, re-educated, Christianized, and transformed into sedentary farmers who posed no threat to American expansion. Carleton had already tested this strategy on the Mescalero Apache, forcing around 500 of them to Bosque Redondo in 1863. And despite the fact that the Mescalero were already suffering from inadequate food, disease, and despair, Carleton decided to expand the program to include the far more numerous Navajo. He needed someone to execute the military campaign that would make this possible, someone with frontier experience, knowledge of the terrain, and a reputation that would intimidate the Navajo into surrender. He needed Kit Carson, and despite the legend that would grow around him, Carson accepted the assignment that would define his legacy forever. Christopher Kit. Carson was already an American legend when Carleton called him to duty in 1863. He had been a fur trapper, a guide for John C. Fremont's famous expeditions that mapped the West, a scout and a soldier who fought Confederates and Mescalero Apache with equal efficiency. Newspapers portrayed him as the embodiment of frontier virtue: brave, resourceful, a man who understood Indians and could negotiate with them when possible and defeat them when necessary. The reality was more complicated. Carson was 54 years old, tired, suffering from health problems, and reportedly wanted to resign from military service to return to his wife and children. He submitted a resignation letter that was rejected by his superiors, and rather than insisting or deserting, he accepted his orders. Whether he embraced the campaign enthusiastically or executed it reluctantly out of duty is debated by historians, but the outcome remains undeniable. Kit Carson became the primary instrument of Navajo destruction, and no amount of claimed reluctance changes the fact that he did the job efficiently and thoroughly. If you're finding this story as devastating and important as we believe it is, please hit that subscribe button right now. We're working hard to reach 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps us continue bringing these crucial, untold stories to light. Your support means everything to our channel. Carleton's orders to Carson were explicit and left no room for mercy. Invade Navajo territory, destroy their crops and food stores, kill or capture their livestock, deny them access to water sources, and force them through starvation and exposure to surrender and accept relocation to Bosque Redondo. This was scorched earth warfare applied to civilian populations, and Carson executed it with systematic precision. In 1863, Carson commanded between 400 and 1,000 troops. The numbers varied throughout the campaign, composed of regular Army soldiers, New Mexico volunteers, and indigenous scouts from tribes hostile to the Navajo, including Ute and Pueblo warriors, who saw this as an opportunity to settle old scores. The Navajo, recognizing that they couldn't defeat American forces in open battle, adopted guerrilla tactics, dispersing into small family groups, hiding in remote canyons and mountains, attempting to outlast the campaign until winter forced the soldiers to withdraw. But Carson had no intention of withdrawing, and he understood that if he couldn't catch Navajo warriors, he could destroy the material basis of Navajo survival and force them to choose between surrender and death by starvation. Throughout the summer and fall of 1863, Carson's troops swept across Navajo territory like a plague, leaving nothing but devastation in their wake. They burned cornfields ready for harvest, destroyed stores of dried beans and squash that families had saved for winter, set fire to hogans, the traditional Navajo homes, and smashed pottery, baskets, and tools that represented generations of accumulated wealth and knowledge. Most catastrophically, they slaughtered sheep by the thousands. Navajo families watched from hiding as soldiers shot their flocks, leaving carcasses to rot because the goal wasn't to feed the army, but to starve the Navajo. They seized water sources, camping at springs and streams to prevent Navajo families from accessing water, knowing that in the desert Southwest, controlling water meant controlling life itself. The campaign was devastatingly effective because Carson understood that the Navajo economy depended on their flocks and crops. Without them, even the most determined warrior became a desperate father watching his children starve, and desperate people surrender. The final blow came in January 1864 when Carleton ordered Carson to penetrate the heart of Navajo resistance, Canyon de Chelly, the sacred fortress that had sheltered the Diné for generations. The canyon was considered nearly impregnable, towering sandstone walls rising hundreds of feet, narrow passages that could be easily defended, water sources hidden inside canyons, and terrain that Navajo defenders knew intimately while invaders struggled to navigate. But Carson divided his forces, sending Captain Albert Pfeiffer to enter from the east while Carson himself advanced from the west. And between January 12th and 14th, 1864, they converged on the canyon in what would be remembered as the Battle of Canyon de Chelly, though calling it a battle dignifies what was really a systematic destruction of civilian infrastructure. Carson commanded 389 soldiers against a Navajo force that was numerically larger but consisted primarily of families trying to protect their last refuge, rather than warriors prepared for combat. The American troops didn't need to win battles. They simply burned every hogan, destroyed every food cache, and most symbolically devastating, they cut down approximately 3,000 peach trees that Navajo families had cultivated for generations. Those peach trees represented more than food. They were living history, connections to ancestors who had planted them, symbols of permanence in a world that was collapsing. Watching those trees fall, watching flames consume orchards that had survived droughts and Apache raids and Spanish cruelty, Navajo families understood that this was different from previous conflicts. This wasn't about stealing livestock or punishing raids. This was about erasing Navajo existence from the land itself, about making it impossible for the Diné to survive as a people in their own territory. Barbonchito and Manuelito, two of the most respected Navajo leaders, tried to organize resistance. But what could arrows do against soldiers who wouldn't even engage them directly, who simply destroyed everything and moved on? By the time Carson's troops withdrew from Canyon de Chelly, they had broken Navajo resistance not through military victory, but through the promise of death by starvation if families didn't surrender. Throughout the spring of 1864, Navajo families began straggling into American forts, skeletal from hunger, children crying from cold and fear, elders barely able to walk, all of them defeated not by superior courage or tactics, but by the simple reality that you cannot eat pride and you cannot feed your family on resistance when there is no food left anywhere. What happened next was the long walk, and even the name fails to capture the horror of what the United States government inflicted on the Navajo people between 1864 and 1866. Approximately 8,000 to 10,000 Navajo, entire families, whole clans, were forced to march between 250 and 450 miles from their homeland to Bosque Redondo, the reservation that General Carleton had prepared for them in eastern New Mexico. The marches happened in multiple waves over 2 years, and conditions varied, but the pattern was consistent. Men, women, children, pregnant women, elderly people unable to walk, all forced to travel on foot across desert and mountain, through summer heat and winter snow, with inadequate food, insufficient water, and guards who viewed them as barely human obstacles to be moved as efficiently as possible. Navajo survivors who passed down oral histories to their descendants described horrors that official army records conveniently omitted. Families subsisted on raw flour and rancid bacon when they received rations at all, and many days there was nothing. Guards shot people who fell behind because they were too weak or sick to maintain the pace. Witnesses reported bodies left in the snow, elderly people and children who simply couldn't walk another step and were killed rather than allowed to rest. Women and girls were routinely raped by soldiers and civilian teamsters. Sexual violence so common that it barely merited mention in some accounts because it was simply understood as what happened to indigenous women in American custody. Even worse, hostile tribes and Mexican slave traders followed the columns of marchers, picking off vulnerable women and children who strayed from the main group or fell behind, knowing the army wouldn't protect them and that Navajo captives could be sold in markets that still operated despite official prohibition. The exact number who died during the Long Walk may never be known with certainty, but estimates range from several hundred to over 1,000. And when combined with deaths at Bosque Redondo itself, the total mortality reaches between 2,500 and 3,500 Navajo and Mescalero Apache out of a population of perhaps 12,000, roughly 1 in 4 people killed by a policy explicitly designed by the United States government and executed by its military. Modern historians have a term for this: ethnic cleansing. The goal wasn't extermination in the sense of killing every single Navajo, but it was the deliberate destruction of Navajo culture, identity, and ability to exist as a people in their homeland. And that fits every scholarly definition of ethnic cleansing that has been developed to describe atrocities in other parts of the world. The Navajo and Mescalero who survived the Long Walk found not salvation, but a different kind of death at Bosque Redondo, which the government called a reservation, and the Navajo experienced as a concentration camp. General Carleton had envisioned a model agricultural community where indigenous people would learn American farming techniques, embrace Christianity, and become productive citizens grateful for the civilization being forced upon them. The reality was a humanitarian catastrophe that shocked even some army officers who witnessed it. The land itself was unsuitable for agriculture. The soil was poor and alkaline. Insects called cutworms destroyed crops almost as fast as they could be planted. And the climate featured brutal extremes that made outdoor labor dangerous. The Pecos River water was so alkaline that it caused chronic diarrhea and other intestinal diseases. Soldiers stationed at Fort Sumner joked grimly that the more you washed in Pecos water, the dirtier you got. And the joke was less funny when you realized Navajo families had no choice but to drink this water or die of thirst. Approximately 8,000 Navajo were confined to a space designed for perhaps half that number, forced to live alongside Mescalero Apache, with whom they had historical enmities, creating tension and occasional violence that the military did little to prevent. The government had promised adequate food rations, but corruption, mismanagement, and simple indifference meant that supplies were always insufficient, often spoiled, and sometimes diverted entirely by officials who sold government goods for personal profit. Navajo families faced chronic malnutrition that weakened them to disease, and epidemics swept through the overcrowded camps regularly: typhus or typhoid, dysentery, respiratory infections that killed the weak and the very young. Comanche raiders attacked Bosque Redondo periodically, stealing what little livestock the Navajo had been allowed to keep, and sometimes capturing women and children, while army troops who were supposed to protect the reservation failed to respond effectively. Some Navajo women were forced into prostitution, trading sex for food because starvation is a powerful motivator, and soldiers had food while Navajo families did not. The death toll at Bosque Redondo is estimated at around 2,000 Navajo, approximately 1 in every 4 people imprisoned there, dying from disease, malnutrition, exposure, violence, and despair. Parents buried children in unmarked graves, elders who had survived the long walk died within months of arrival, and young men who should have been starting families instead watched helplessly as their people vanished. Kit Carson's role in the Bosque Redondo nightmare is complicated in ways that reveal the inadequacy of simple hero-villain narratives. After successfully forcing Navajo's surrender and relocation, Carson was briefly appointed as the Indian agent responsible for Bosque Redondo. But he hated administrative work, struggled with bureaucracy, and reportedly requested more supplies to feed the starving Navajo before abandoning the position in frustration after only a few months. Some accounts suggest Carson treated surrendering Navajo with relative humanity during the initial relocation, providing blankets and food when possible, and disciplining soldiers who violated truces or abused prisoners. Other sources claim he was furious when junior officers killed Navajo under flags of truce, believing that honor demanded respecting peaceful surrender. But these gestures, even if genuine, cannot erase Carson's fundamental responsibility. He led the campaign that made the long walk possible. He executed Carleton's scorched earth strategy with efficiency that broke Navajo resistance and forced them into a choice between surrender or death. He destroyed the material basis of Navajo survival, burned their crops, killed their livestock, violated their sacred canyon, and made it impossible for them to remain in their homeland. The fact that Carson may have felt uncomfortable with some aspects of what he was ordered to do, the possibility that he showed occasional mercy within a fundamentally merciless campaign, does not absolve him of responsibility for the outcome. He is remembered in Navajo oral history not as a complicated figure torn between duty and conscience, but as the man who destroyed their world, the face of American betrayal and violence. His name became synonymous with the long walk, and that is the legacy he earned regardless of his personal feelings about it. By 1867, even the United States government could no longer ignore that Bosque Redondo was an expensive, deadly failure. The reservation cost enormous amounts of money to maintain, produced almost no agricultural output, generated constant complaints from humanitarian observers and even some military officials, and had utterly failed to transform the Navajo into the compliant Christian farmers Carleton had envisioned. General Carleton himself was reassigned and died shortly after, but the disaster he created continued. Under increasing pressure, and facing the reality that maintaining Bosque Redondo would cost more than simply allowing the Navajo to return home, the government finally agreed to negotiate. On June 1, 1868, Navajo leaders including Barbonchito and Manuelito signed the Treaty of Bosque Redondo, with American officials led by General William Tecumseh Sherman, the same Sherman whose march through Georgia had devastated the Confederacy. The treaty allowed the Navajo to return to a portion of their ancestral territory. Not all of it, not even most of it, but a reservation within the boundaries of their sacred mountains. In exchange, the Navajo agreed to cease raids, accept American authority, allow their children to be educated in American schools, and abandon their traditional patterns of movement in favor of sedentary farming. It was hardly a generous treaty. The Navajo were getting back a fraction of what had been stolen from them, but after 4 years of hell, it represented survival and the possibility of rebuilding. In June 1868, approximately 7,300 Navajo who had survived Bosque Redondo began what they called the Long Walk Home, marching back across the miles they had been forced to walk 4 years earlier. Many of them barefoot, still malnourished, but moving toward home with a determination that transcended physical weakness. Today, the Navajo Nation is the largest Native American tribe in the United States by both population and territory, spanning parts of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. The nation has its own government, courts, schools, and economic development, and Navajo culture, language, ceremonies, weaving traditions, and oral histories has survived despite every attempt to destroy it. But the long walk remains the defining trauma of Navajo collective memory, the story that every Navajo child learns, the historical wound that has never fully healed. The journey to and from Bosque Redondo is commemorated annually, not as ancient history, but as living memory passed down through generations who understand that their very existence is a form of resistance against a government that tried to erase them. The land where Bosque Redondo once operated is now a memorial, and the descendants of those who suffered there return to remember, to mourn, and to ensure that what happened to their ancestors is never forgotten or dismissed as unfortunate, but necessary for progress. Kit Carson died in 1868, the same year the Navajo returned home, and his reputation has undergone dramatic revision in the decades since. The dime novels and frontier mythology that portrayed him as a noble scout and Indian fighter have given way to more honest assessments that recognize his role in ethnic cleansing. Statues have been removed, his name has been stripped from schools and public buildings, and historians now teach the Long Walk not as manifest destiny, but as one of the darkest chapters in American history. The story of Kit Carson and the Navajo is a reminder that heroes are constructed narratives that often erase inconvenient truths, that the winning side writes history in ways that justify their violence, and that the people who suffer most from historical amnesia are always those whose voices were silenced by force. It's also a story about the resilience of people who refuse to vanish, who survived genocide and forced relocation and cultural destruction, and who emerge not broken, but determined to preserve what their ancestors died protecting. If this story moved you, if you believe these histories need to be told and remembered, please subscribe to our channel right now. We're working to reach 1,000 subscribers, and your support makes it possible for us to continue researching and sharing these crucial stories that too often get buried or sanitized in mainstream education. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we explore the complex, painful, and essential histories that shaped America. Because history isn't just what happened in the past. It's the story we choose to tell about who we were and who we want to become. And that choice begins with facing the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us.